Hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about power in international relations. And international relations is essentially, a discussion about power, political power, economic power, social power, and the list goes on. So essentially, power is our discussion today. We're trying to find out what exactly does power mean in international relations. What are the issues involved in power? How do we understand power? All right. So those are the those are the objectives of this presentation. Now, power, like I said, has remained a very very interesting conversation in not just international relations, but in political science, in strategic studies, security studies, in many other social sciences. Power is a very very key concept, and even in management sciences as well. And that has been the case right from time. Power has always been a very, very, very interesting, very controversial concept and subject matter. And we're not surprised about the fact that scholars in international relations have not been able to agree on the concept of power, what it entails, how it can be determined, what constitutes power, and what have you. Scholars are still divided over this issue, and that is expected because the conversations around power show that the concept of power is very highly controversial. All right. Now, there have been disagreements by scholars, like I said, on the role of power. What role does power play, in international relations? How important is it? What exactly constitutes the role, the task, that power accomplishes in international relations? And of course, what is the nature of power? What's the nature of power in international relations? These are areas where scholars have really, really, disagreed. The nature of power and the role of power. Some argue that power, can be measured. You can determine how much power a state has. Some argue that it's not possible to measure power. In fact, most of scholars argue that power is immeasurable. But these are two areas that have been very very controversial: the role of power and the nature of power. All right, Hans Morgenthau, describing power, he said that power poses one of the most difficult and controversial problems of political science. And of course, you have several scholars who have made comments, illustrating how problematic the concept of power has been. These are comments made by Robert Gilpin, and also describing the complexity rather of the concept of power, and how this concept has been very troublesome, very problematic in international relations. All right. So, of course, all of these areas are areas where scholars disagree. Nature of power and the role of power. But scholars have agreed that the concept of power is one that must constantly be interrogated, must constantly talk about it, must constantly discuss it, must constantly study it to try and understand it, a lot better than we did the last time the conversation came up. So the concept of power must constantly be subjected to investigation, to interrogation, to discussion. And that's the only way we can better appreciate, better understand that concept. And so that's why we're talking about it again in this presentation. Now, of course, Several definitions exist of power. In fact, power is one of the concepts that has the most definitions, if I'm not mistaken. Power has a lot of definitions, but one definition that stands out from among all these definitions of power is the fact that power is referred to as a basic intuition, all right, a basic notion of A is used to describe one actor. So actor A causing or having the ability to cause actor B to do something that actor B would otherwise not do. So we're saying that power is defined as an action, a notion, the ability of one actor in international relations, which is described as A now, having the ability of causing or having the ability to cause another actor, an actor B, to do something that other actor B would otherwise not do. That is one very interesting, and very widely accepted definition, most commonly used and accepted definition of power that exists. Now, of course, power also is used most times interchangeably with other concepts like control, like influence, like persuasion, compelling, and so on and so forth. But it's important to understand that even though all these concepts have a common element, power still is unique. The concept of power is also unique. It's also unique, and so while we may be caught up in using them interchangeably, we must understand that power, is a much more unique concept to these other concepts, and so we must understand power from the point, of the arguments that are out there about what power entails and how power can be understood. All right, there are certain characteristics of power as well. I call it political power here because our conversation about international relations basically has to do with politics, and of course, if you understand what politics is, you know that politics permeates every other aspect of society, because man, like Aristotle said, is a political animal. So characteristics of power are that, number one, power is relative. Power is relative. So this means that power is exercised in consideration of the actors involved. So if actor A has to exercise power or has to enter a relationship with actor B, actor A understands the potentials, the capabilities, the capacities of actor B, and it is based, as well as actor B understands the same capabilities and potentials of actor A. And so it is based on these understandings of these actors of one another that they will exercise power over each other. Let me give you an example. If Nigeria is getting into a relationship with China, Nigeria understands the capabilities, the potentials, in probability that China has. China also has an idea of how much capacity and ability that Nigeria has. And this understanding is what will guide the relationship as to how they exercise power over one another. That's what we mean by power being relative. So the kind of power Nigeria will exert when it is interacting with China will be a lot different from the kind of power it will exert when it's interacting with Togo, as an example. Because the actor has changed. So power has also relatively changed to suit the actor. That's what we mean by relativity of power. Power is exercised by taking into account the actors involved in such a power relationship. All right. The second feature, characteristic, is that power is relational. That means power cannot be exercised in isolation. There has to be at least two actors for a power relationship to exist. An actor cannot exercise power over itself. An actor must exercise power in relation to another actor. And so that's what the relational nature of power is. Number 3 is that power is multidimensional. All right, there are many sides, there are multiple sides to power. There's the military side, there's the economic side, there's the symbolic side, there's the religious side. We're going to look at all of these sides, as we go along. So power is multidimensional, and so you cannot quantify power. You cannot measure it, and that's the final feature characteristics is immeasurable. Because of all of these things we have stated above, relativity, relational nature, and the multidimensional nature of power, it is difficult to measure power. It's difficult to measure power, even though we can guess, we can hypothesize about how much power a state has, but knowing exactly the total nature or extent of state power is almost nearly impossible. Now, the dimensions of power, like we said, power is multi and not unidimensional. It is multidimensional. All right, it means that power can increase in one dimension and reduce in another dimension. Let me give you an example. If we're saying, if just like I said, Nigeria interacting with China, right? Power in that direction, or power in that dimension of interaction, the power of Nigeria will reduce because of its interaction with China. But if Nigeria at the same time is interacting with Togo, Nigeria's power in interacting with Togo will also increase because the domain of power has changed. The domain of power has changed. The actors are different. And so the nature of power, the dimension of power, the amount of power would also change. 5 important dimensions of power that exist in literature are the scope of power, the domain of power, the weight of power, the cost, and the means of power. All right. So, and these are dimensions of power. These are 5 ways of viewing, of understanding how much power a state is likely to have. You look at the domain of power, you look at the scope of power, you look at the weight, the cost, the means. These are the dimensions of understanding power in international relations. Now, the scope of power refers to the aspects of the other actor's behavior that an actor is able to affect. All right, the aspects of the behavior of the other actor. Remember, we said that power is the ability of A to get B to do what B will otherwise not do. So if A is able to influence 2 or 3 aspects of B's behavior, and what do we mean by aspects? Perhaps A is able to influence B's educational policy. That's one aspect. A is able to influence B's economic policy. That's another aspect. A is able to influence B's transportation policies, local transportation policy, how many railway networks they have, who does the contract, the railway contract, what goes into the railway contract, transportation policies. That's another aspect of B's behavior. So if A is able to influence all 3 aspects of B's behavior, education, economic, transportation, then it means that A has more power over B because of the scope of A's power over B. It's going to be different if A is able to influence just one aspect, perhaps just the educational policy, and A doesn't have power over, or A is not able to exercise much influence on the transportation policy or the economic policy of B. So the more aspects of B's behavior that actor A is able to influence determines or reveals how much more power A has over B. If A is able to influence more aspects, it means that it has more power. If it is able to influence just a few aspects, it means that it has, not so much power over B. All right. So, of course, the scope of power may vary from one issue to another, right? It may vary from one issue to another. If if um, if A is able to influence two aspects of B's behavior, maybe economic and educational, the level of influence that A will have on education might not be the same level of influence to have on economics. It might not be the same. Of course, might not be the same level of influence. So it might influence economics much more than to influence education. So power in terms of scope depends on how many aspects, and how much power is exerted on each of these aspects of B's behavior. That is what the scope of power entails. The domain of power, which is the second dimension of power, involves how big the A actor is, the actor that is exerting the influence. How big is that actor? Big in terms of what is the geography size, maybe the population, the amount of power capability it has, to exert an influence on another actor. And then how many actors can A exercise an influence over? Remember, scope has to do with how many aspects of one actor, but domain has to do with how many actors itself can A influence. And a very good example of this is the role of China in Africa and the role of China in North America or Europe. All right. While China, as an A actor now, as the actor A, while China has more power, has more domain in Africa, because China is able to influence many more African countries, it doesn't have as much domain in North America. It doesn't have as much influence in North America. So the domain of China is more when it comes to Africa than it is in North America. All right. So that is what it means with the domain of power. China has more influence in many countries in Africa, but it doesn't have as much influence in countries in North America, Canada, the US, Mexico. It doesn't have as much influence on these countries as it does on African countries. The weight of power is usually measured in probability. So, what is the probability that an actor is able to influence or affect the behavior of the other actor? It is a probable assumption. All right, the weight of power. So if actor A most likely has 90% chance of influencing the action of actor B, it means that A has more power over B. But if A has just 20-30% probability chance of influencing the actions or the activities of B, then it means that A doesn't have as much power over B as it is when it has a 90% probability chance. So the weight of power is measured in probability. The higher the probability of power, the more power a state is believed to have over another actor. All right, and they said that excuse me, this dimension is referred to as the reliability of an actor's influence. The reliability. All right, the reliability of an actor's influence. How reliable, to what extent can an actor's influence be guaranteed over another actor? And of course, we said that can be measured only in probability, percentages. The cost of power, which is the fourth dimension, occurs on the two sides. So you have actor A and B in a relationship, how much does it cost A to influence B's behavior? How much does it cost B to comply with A's demands? So the actor that spends more, or the actor that it costs more, has less power. So if it costs A more, if it is more expensive for A to influence B's actions, it means that B is more powerful than A. And if it is more expensive for B to comply with A's demand, it means that A is more powerful than B. So whichever actor spends more has less power. Whichever actor spends less has more power. That's the dynamics of the cost of power. So if it is costing me more to influence the actor of B, it means that I don't have as much power over B as I claim. But if it's costing me less to influence B's behavior, then obviously I have a considerable amount of power over B. That's the cost of power. It's measured from both sides. It's measured from both sides. Both A and B actors must count the cost must count the cost in complying or in maintaining a power relationship with any other actor in international relations. And the last dimension is the means of power. There are 4 means by which power can be exercised. The symbolic means, which has to do with communicative actions, propaganda, discourses, protests, rallies, all of these are symbolic means by which protest rallies now not necessarily using NGOs, using international NGOs, using civil society groups. States can sponsor certain rallies, can sponsor certain protests over other policies or over policies, programs of other states that they are not comfortable with. All right. So these are some symbolic means by which power is exercised. Power can also be exercised by economic means, reducing goods and services or increasing goods and services, and of course the politics of demand and supply and what it can do in an economy. Power can be exercised with military means, and this is the most common, the most widely known means of power. The military means, perhaps because it is more traditional, it is more conservative or conventional. It's more conventional, and of course you have the diplomatic means, where diplomacy is used to ensure non-violent process that leads to desired result at the end of the day. So these are the means through which power is exercised. So the point we're making is that of these 5 dimensions of power, power can vary. It can cost a state less, can cost a state less to influence the behavior of other states, whereas they have just a very small domain of power, even though it costs them less. So the cost can be less, while the domain is not so much, while the weight of power is very low, while the scope is very low. So it is difficult, it's very complex to measure power, bearing in mind these 5 dimensions that we have looked at. It's very complex to measure power. All right, estimating or measuring power. Of course, we have talked about the complexity that is involved in measuring power because of the multidimensional nature of power. So where a state has more power in terms of scope, it might not have as much domain. It might have to bear more costs. So there's just a whole lot of complexities in trying to measure power. And of course, power has been put side by side, has been equated, or has been compared with purchasing power. Political power has been compared with purchasing power. In terms of purchasing power, you have a currency, you have a currency by which you can determine how much purchasing power an actor has. You can go to the bank and easily determine this is the amount of money in this person's or in this actor's, these organizations' accounts. That is how much, that is the amount of purchasing power that this actor has. But when it comes to political power, you don't have such measuring instruments like the currency that you have in terms of purchasing power. Such measuring instrument is absent. And so it is more complex. It's more difficult to measure political power as opposed to purchasing, or perhaps some other kinds of power that there are. I think it's also important to mention the fact that the overall estimates of an actor's power, like we said, cannot be known, because an actor might have more power in a certain dimension and have a considerable amount of minimal power in another dimension, and have very low power in another dimension. So it is difficult to calculate or to determine the overall total amount of power that an actor has in international relations. And that's why states are always very careful in their interactions with other states, because you never really know. Even when you have done your analysis, when you have done your costing, when you have done your homework, you are never really certain how much power the other actor has. So in conclusion, it is important to note that while all politics is power politics, while all politics involves some amount of power in it, politics is not only about power. I hope that is clear. I'll take that again. While all politics involves some amount of power, everything that human beings do, has elements of politics in it. And we're saying that in these political activities that we do, especially now on the international scene, all the activities that states do are politically motivated, and these activities are driven by power. They are driven by power, but not all these activities are about power. So power is a concept that is involved in almost all the activities and interactions that actors have on the international scene. But not all the actions and interactions of actors are essentially about power. Unfortunately, though, such actions involve certain aspects, certain amounts of power in carrying them out, even though they are not necessarily centered around power itself. I hope that is clear. So, not everything that happens in international relations is about power. International relations includes issues of environmental security. That's not necessarily about power. They include issues of migration. That's not essentially about power. They include issues of deforestation. That's not essentially about power. They include issues of human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking. These are not essentially issues of power. But in addressing these issues that international relations involves itself in, power comes to play. That's the point we're making. So while international relations is not essentially about power, um, power is used, power is involved in interactions and negotiations on the international scene. I'm sure that is clear. That is clear. So that is the crux of these presentations or this presentation rather. And of course, as we continue to progress into the near future, we will understand that power will remain a very, very key aspect of international relations. And we cannot exhaust, even in the near future, all the concerns that are thrown up by the concept of power in international relations. We can only continue to study and try to understand better how power relationships work among actors in international relations. We're going to have to end our discussion at this juncture. If there are any questions or comments, observations, you can contact me through my contact details which you have, and we can continue the conversations afterwards. Thank you for listening.